All right, welcome to our unit on Greece. I'm combining a few chapters here dealing with ancient Greece and what we think of as sort of the more modern era when it's unified. What's really important about Greece is that this is our staging and launching point to what we know as Western civilization. This is going to be specifically this chapter is going to cover how we go about getting our politics, our way of thinking, our language, and that's really what I want to stress with the importance of Greece is that from Greece, every culture, every civilization that follows is influenced by it in some manner. So I'm going to start with the ancient Greeks and give you a little bit of background. Once again, this is really sort of just that survey look and trying to hit the most important parts because especially with this chapter and subsequent chapters, there's a lot of material to cover, right? We finally are getting things written down where us as historians can evaluate them. If you are getting a little confused though, I have a great little YouTube video set up on your Moodle shell. It's only about 20 minutes long, and it goes through all of what I'm talking about here in sort of a recap format. And I highly suggest watching that film, even maybe even before you watch this one, just so you kind of get a better idea of what's going on, because there's a lot of hop skipping going around. So we'll get to it. All right. In this presentation, like I said, I'm gonna do more highlights. I've broken it really into two parts and try to follow a timeline. We're going to cover in the first part its early history and talk about the three main cultural developments that are happening, and then we're going to move into Greece as it's formulated into a lot of sort of the mythologies that we know or stereotypically think about when we think of Greece. I've mentioned this before in Egypt, in the Egyptian module, is that you're going to start to see these sort of like tie-ins visually within the artwork that allow us to see how trade is now being influenced, right? We have Mesopotamia is really at its height, and it's sort of the biggest city in the earliest form of the timeline. Egypt has the pyramids risen, and now Greece is going to have these three little cultures kind of happening, and from there you realize like, wow, okay, there's a lot of people now across in the Mediterranean Middle East area, and so there's going to be a lot of crossover. There's going to be a lot of trade. Yes, there's going to be a lot of warring too, but even with war and small units sort of fighting one another, they're going to take the resources, right? To the victor go the spoils, and from that there's new sort of artistic styles. There's new materials that are shared in that way. They're going to bring these materials back. They're going to be looked at, and they're going to be researched. So that's what's happening with these groups. So the prehistoric Aegean, starting about 3,000, somebody says like 3,700 years ago. This we know of because of what we assume is a male writer named Homer, right? He writes the Iliad and the Odyssey. You may have had to read those at some point in your schooling, or maybe if you really enjoy Greek culture. But that gives us our best understanding of early Greek history. And when you watch the film, they talk about early Greek history, and then there's sort of this dark age, and then there's sort of this resurgence with what we know as Greece now. So we're at the very beginning, and Homer writes this stuff, but at first nobody's taking it seriously. Nobody believes that what Homer wrote, or if it was a compilation of books or whatever, is even true. So those theories were really put to test when Heinrich Schliemann decided that he was going to find Troy. And when Troy was found on the western part of Turkey, that really sort of realized that, okay, there's some underlying truth to what Homer is writing. Like, yes, there's a lot of mythologies, there's a lot of, there's the Cyclops and the Sirens, and there's all these sort of what seem to be superficial characters. But what we do know is that, they're stand-ins for something else, and these are sort of an account of what people believed and also what happened. So anyway, So the three geographic areas I'm going to break down is the Cycladic, the Minoan, and the Helladic, also known as the Mycenaean. And those areas, right, the Cycladic are in the islands called the Cyclades. The Minoan is central really to Crete, and the Helladic or the Mycenaean are on the Greek mainland, right? So they've sort of set up. Now, all of these have advancements, of course, within sailing. They are trading. They are, and that's how we know of their works. And to jump into the first one, so the Cyclades, we can see all those islands. If you've ever been around to Greece and you wanted to go jump around those islands, that's where like Santorini is, all this sort of like beautiful, white building, blue roofs that you think of. And what they're really famous for, these sort of stylized characters. Now, immediately you may look at this and say, oh, wow, that posture and that look is almost very prehistoric, right? Our Venus, right? Where we have these crossed arms. Once again, on our Venus de Willendorf, it was over the breast, but over here we still have those same crossed arms, right? We have a stylization, but a focus on sexual body parts. So there aren't too many really leaps when we look at this. Yes, it's different than anything we've seen before, and you may even say, "Wow, this could have been made in the 1920s in like modern art movements." But it's very old, and these places in the Cyclades have a lot of reserve of marbles, so we see that in their work, right? Most are representative nude women, which we see here, but there have been some that are male, but very, very, very few. And so that leads us to believe that maybe these are fertility charms or use of rituals for some kind, right? Maybe it's when I lived abroad in a village in Peace Corps, tokens were given when people were married. So, for the idea of here's fertility, or maybe, if a woman was pregnant, they were given a token. So maybe it would help with the birth. So there may be things like that, right? But, basically like a good luck charm. They're stylistic, but they're refined, right? We can tell that great care was taken of this. It wasn't that they were just like, well, this is the best I can do. We can see that they're taking time to incise lines, to polish, and we can even see the remnants of what looks to be some sort of, paint. It could be the stone itself too. But a lot of sculptures have been found later that had bits of some sort of pigmentation on them. So I would not be surprised if at some point these had been painted as well. So we see that great craft taken by this craft person when they're making it. Now, interesting enough, they don't stand on their own. So maybe they are meant to lie down. We put in speculation that maybe because of that, they're part of a burial and buried with an individual. Many of these pieces have been found, but a lot of them come from second, third, and fourth sources because they were so popular that places and sites were being looted for them. So there's still a lot of mystery with it. To give you an example of what the male sort of counterpart of this would look like is this harp player. Now this gives us an even broader understanding because the male itself, we can see that the head is sort of shaped and stylized a little bit differently, but this one has a little bit more triangular, where this one gets a little bit more oval shaped as the forehead curves back. But we can almost imagine with the head tilted back a little bit that this person's probably even singing. You'd imagine tilting your head back while you play to sing. We can tell that this is a harp or musical instrument, because they've actually found the instruments too. But this is a pretty interesting representation, right? It gives us an idea that, okay, here's an instrument, here's their music that they're playing. This must be some sort of important, maybe the harp itself or a harp player was needed as a sculpture token, because maybe the person dead this was their job, right? Maybe this was an associated icon with them. So maybe we see people in roles, right? And the sculpture reflects the role. I'm not really sure. A lot of speculation there, but it's pretty beautiful nonetheless. Now the Minoan art down there in Crete, down here on this large island at the bottom, right? The largest of the islands. This is really cool because it does give us a lot of mythology, like the earliest of mythologies to Greece culture. And in the video, they talk about this Knossos Palace, and what's really interesting for it in it is that it had no defenses, right? And so it's not so much that Crete was conquered; it was pretty much on the out already. And so when the Mycenaeans came in, it's not like they needed to come through and war and take everything and like burn everything down. They didn't do that. They basically showed up and like, oh, it's no one's here. Oh, well, we conquered them, right? So this is the idea. And with that, this is where like the mythology of King Minos comes from. So this was his palace, Minos, Minoan, king of the Minoans. And in that mythology is this labyrinth underneath. Now, if you look at sort of the layout of this, it is somewhat of a labyrinth, right? It's tiered, it's built on top of each other. And in this labyrinth, right, is the Minotaur. And so, the savage king with his Minotaur. And if you know the story, I believe it's Theseus, but it in there, he's able to defeat, and that's sort of more of a synonymous tale of like, hey, us as Mycenaeans, our warrior came in and defeated, this evil Minotaur, and thus, the king, and we conquer, right? And so that's really the underlying theme of this story, even though, of course, yes, it never happened, but it's interesting how that construct comes from. So that's what I was talking about earlier when I was saying things that Homer wrote down. Right now that we're finding ruins and more evidence of these sites and places, you can see like, oh, okay, yeah, it really didn't go this way, but yeah, they did conquer it, right? They did take over it and make it sort of part of their own. What's most important about Minoan art is their pottery, but I'm really going to focus on the image in the upper left. This is a very famous fresco, and it's the bull leaping, or just simply called bull leaping, or the bull fresco, and it shows us a lot of style or stylistically how they created their artwork. They were not as engaged with like we have to have proper proportions and stuff. There's more symbolic and gestural. So for example, in here, if I was to ask you of those figures, what gender are they, right? Probably say, oh, well, they look male, right? And then there's one darker one, so maybe that person is a slave, or maybe there's something. Well, actually, lighter skinned individuals in Minoan artwork are female, and darker are male. So that's how they're distinguishing between the two. So by having them engage together, we realize it's, wow, okay, both genders are maybe more engaged in every activity with one another. So there may not be such like a hierarchy of genders. Who knows? Maybe that's something that this tells us. What's very, very interesting is we see this very large bull, right? When we look at the proportions to the human there. And at first, these bulls were thought of as non-existent, but this leads us back to the Minotaur, and these bulls are now sort of an extinct species of bulls, but they did exist. We actually find I believe there are hoof prints that they were able to cast that show sort of a scale of how large these things are. So they're not really over exaggerating that much. Now, with this, another thing that's very interesting is we see the individual, and if you were able to zoom in closely or look at the image in your book, you'll notice the horns of the bull go underneath the arms of the individual. So they're thinking, wow, is this some sort of ritual? Because is there sort of this tactic where you get on the bull's horns, and of course it tries to gore you, and in doing so you're lifted up and thrown, and you're leaping over the back, maybe doing some acrobats like the male figure seems to be shown, and maybe the person in the end is either spotting, or maybe they've already landed, right? Maybe there's some sort of tactics to this. Well, historians, terrible story enough, the historians have actually tried to reenact this, and people have been severely injured and even killed. So we don't believe that this is actually possible for a couple reasons. One, there's no way of knowing where the bull is going to turn its head when it tries to gore, so you can't really position yourself quick enough. Also, there's no way that your body would fit in between it, right? You're going to get gored no matter what. It's funny that somebody's actually tried this. You'd think it'd be like try with the crash test dummy first or something. But anyway, so that's what's going on. But it leaves us in a lot of mystery and speculation. Like, what is this? What is this sort of ceremonial piece? So there's still a lot written about it today. In the pottery, moving on to the pottery, right, we see similar sort of stylization representation of their work, right? We know that this is, and it's really cool, this octopus jar, right? I really love this. But what's most important is that we notice that it was created on a wheel. And so when we think of ceramic forms and earlier ceramic forms, we're now seeing the invention of the potter's wheel, so we can make something that's very symmetrical. And so with that, we have some more stable proportions, and these vessels are highly sought after and are actually a high commodity of trade for them. So it's very common that in shipwrecks that are still discovered in the Mediterranean that date back, that we see a lot of just ceramic jars that seem to have been transported, and they were used for every purpose in life. Minoan's sculpture. This is a very famous piece. It's called the Snake Goddess. It's of a female figure that stands with snakes. It has a cat or feline structure on its head, and with that, it has a little bit of suggestions of maybe even Egyptian art, using sort of those animals and combination with humans that have also been linked to Mesopotamia. But we know that, like, for the feline in Egyptian culture was highly regarded, and so therefore maybe they were, within trade, that maybe there were some associations with that they were adopting. This figure may be a deity, but it's also suggested maybe more of a shaman or fetish priest. If it's a deity, we have linked to other sort of gods, representation in human form. Now, when you do watch the film, that short film I mentioned earlier, you will see that it is a little bit more stylistically dressed for women to be topless in this manner. So we're not seeing sort of like an exposure of a god. This is still like cultural appropriate dress. But what's very interesting, right, is sort of the attention to look at all the textures and patterns that are on this figure. And I think that's something, if you're going to write about this, you'd mention those and their elements, because that gives us a window that says, there was something that they really wanted to spend more time on this piece, on this figure, for a very reason, which means there's got to be an importance somehow. All right. The Mycenaean or Helladic art in the area where they were, right? This is where we think of, like, so we have Athens and such over here, right? The Peloponnese, Sparta is going to be over here. And, having the mainland is probably the biggest advantage for why they are so dominant. If you have the mainland, you have more sustainable ways of gathering food, dealing with population, resources that are available to you, so for the technologies that can advance. So when thinking of that, it seems like a natural way why they sort of emerged. Of all the three tribes, they were the ones that emerged. One of the biggest things that they talk about is sort of this Lion's Gate, right? We see some beginning of really high relief carving that's going on above this gate. But this development on the mainland of Greece was happening at the same time as on Crete and the Minoan. It's speculated that the Mycenaean took over the Minoans because of their architectural features, a lack of defense I'd mentioned before. Minoans didn't have those. Well, Mycenaean, they did, right? And they were very good at sort of more or less war, right? They were more prepared for it. So they were building fortified complexes as they were moving on. So it's not like they could just be easily taken back. This just shows a simple post and lintel system, but using large stones, monoliths. And you should check out the video link on this. It's really cool, the site and what's going on, and it gives you a little bit more perspective of the area and why this is of importance. Some of this work we haven't seen before is metal, right? I talked a little bit about their advancement in technology, so they're dealing more with different types of metals. Now, for the longest time, this face mask on the right was thought of as King Agamemnon's death mask. Agamemnon being a part of the Trojan War. In fact, the one who starts it really by wanting to go and get Helen, his wife, who's been whisked away, get her back. And it's later been debunked that this isn't true, but this would have been a burial mask, similar like what we think of like King Tut, right? This would have been put over. What's really beautiful about this is sort of that pounded relief, right? It's one sheet. So they would have taken a lump of the material, gold in this case, and combined. So they had a big sort of lump of it, like you think of like a lump of clay, and then slowly just pounding it down thin and thin and thinner and thinner, like almost like aluminum foil would be thin, and then being able to shape that over. I'm not sure necessarily if they actually shaped it over an individual's face to get their actual features, but stylistically they could have put it over another sort of carving that they'd made, or just you worked from the back. But there are more examples of metalwork shown in your book, but this is the most interesting. Right, this is the one that I think carries the most weight, which tells us how they're treating their dead. It shows the amount of wealth. If you're able to use this much, not only was the person important, but you're able to mine resources and stuff. What's kind of cool about this is that they have been determined, because of the features that they can talk about, the sex and the age, because they did give some very specifics, right, in dimensions. So that's kind of cool that scientists are able to track some of that stuff back now, as we see science in earlier forms of art being able to use technology to sort of trim back and find more truth, right? It's really incredible. If you are a fan of watching documentaries, there always seems to be some new thing that comes out that kind of dispels the rumor. So now, ancient Greece. So we're going to sort of skip over the Dark Ages because, as mentioned, right, that we had these two forms of writing, version A and version B, and those forms of writing, version A never was decoded, right? It just is there. Version B has common characters into the Greek alphabet, so there's a little bit more understanding of it. But getting into ancient Greece, this is where we start to see the heart of the Western world develop. I mean, it's so important that we cannot really talk about anything in our society, government, ethics, philosophy, art, education, without starting at Greece. Even the term university, right, was the term that they used for their training, because it means united through diversity, this idea of coming together with diverse minds and talking about it. So that's why why we still use the term. It's a common understanding that you'll probably get the sort of the biggest names at this time and how Greece impacted the world. We talk about the Olympics. We're gonna talk about the Spartans. We're gonna talk about all really what we think of when we think of Greece. It's good to note too that if you haven't read in the book sort of about their mythologies, very similar to the Egyptians, go ahead and read about that so you have an understanding of sort of Zeus and how they see the creation of the world, and sort of those gods and goddesses, how they play a role in everyday life, right? That they aren't just omnipotent and up above. They actually interact with humans, either helping them or deceiving them or such. So. And we're going to talk about 5 different time periods of this sort of ancient Greece time. As I was talking about, read those about the gods, but this it's very important to know that depending on sort of the gods they worshipped, it depends on sort of what their advancements or focus were. And so that's why I say just kind of go and briefly read over that and sort of refresh your mind on each of those characters, because that's why their art was created, was to please them, right? So we need to have an understanding of what it would be that would please them. Okay. So some of the terms that you'll need to know are things like geometric and orientalizing, right? And Greece at this time is shows its reaches. It's taken over the Mediterranean Sea. It's trading all over. The movie talks about this analogy of they were like frogs on a pond, right? They just kind of keep spreading and spreading and going farther and farther out, and that's how they did. There's like no need to stop, and we see this highly stylized representation of the human form in their pottery and sculpture, and some of these are coming from inspirations that have been found either back east, Middle East, and within Egyptian art. So we find these fragments around Athens, right? We can start to sort of link them. Examples of this type of pottery have even been found in Russia, France, and the Sudan. So it shows you a little bit of the reach of their arm. And this is allowing Greek artists to come back with other ideas too. So it's not like these are just one-way streets, right? Artists are just sponges, and they're just going to just soak up as much as they can. And especially at this time, any new technique or any new technology is just sort of like, wow, this is revolutionary. So you're always going to try to get your hands on that, and the culture is really thirsting for it. This vase here is an example of the highly sought after pieces in trade. It's an example of black figure painting, in which we see a huge advancement because we have a kiln that's finally really being used and controlled to create these colors. So knowing that they're developing these kilns to go with their ceramics also lets us know, like, wow, they have really put some time in on these technologies, right? They're able to control their glazes, to know when to layer, how high to fire. And if you know anything about ceramics, everything takes a certain cone temperature. It's not that you just stick it in there on high and in 15 minutes presto, right? There is a science to how the vessel is fired depending on its clay, then let alone its glaze and its components that make those up. So the reason why it's called black figure painting, of course, is that right now we have black on this red, and we're going to see reversal of that soon enough. So just kind of keep this sort of straight in your mind, because you'll need to know both for the test. All right. As we move into the archaic period, right, we're seeing this advancement and strong influences of other cultures continue. We're seeing strong similarities to Egyptian sculpture. It's apparent that they're borrowing from one another by the stance, the body placement, the pose, and the idea that they're nude. Figures are still stiff, right? And being stiff is, when I refer to that, more or less talks about, like, yes, they may have anatomy and stuff correct, but they don't really know how to work with their materials really without breaking it, without, the idea is to get this perfect form. And Greek is all about idealized beauty. What is the perfect form? So they're taking what they have and like, okay, that's good, but let's get it even better and even better and even better. So really the if you could imagine an artist guild at this time, and their number one thing that they're supposed to do is say, we got to get this perfect. It needs to be the exact perfect of a human form, like as if we've duplicated it, almost as if we've created it like God would have created it. Okay. And there's some examples in your book that I give you there, but really what we're seeing is, to help sort of make this thing feel like it has life, and I highlight it, is this archaic smile. Now, this is the first time that it's being used, and ever since then, it just becomes widely used after that. And it's sort of this smirk. You almost even think of it kind of like the Mona Lisa, right? That just feels like the lips have something like they're just about to say, or a gesture or movement, and they realize, like, wow, if I tweaked it this much, now the life is coming into it just 10 times fold. So the archaic smile comes about and becomes this, and we can see it here, right? When we go from, here's those three examples talking about, but here's, okay, yeah, we got basic lips to generic smile to more of like, okay, now we have that refinement. And so here's the stages of these kyrios, meaning youth, these young boys, right? And these sculptures are very predominant. There's tons of these young boy or kyrios sculptures that have been found in different sort of states. Now, when we look at it, it does, in the first one specifically, look very Egyptian when we think of the king and the queen slate piece that I showed earlier. right? 1 foot forward. But we do notice that they're able to separate it from the block. So we do know that they're able to, whether their stone is of a different quality, or their tools, or they're understanding how to get that weight positioned correctly so it holds. Now the arms themselves are not freed yet. And as you move, like, all right, well, there's been some different gestures, different types. We see a little bit more of emphasis on clothing, right? It still sort of clings to the body as if it's lightly draped, but they're experimenting even more. And of course, by even adding something like this animal, probably maybe this was even used as sort of an offering piece. But then even later, right, we go right back. We see a direct correlation between number 1 and number 3. But notice now that the arms themselves have been pretty much separated from the body. The stance is still the same, but look at how even between the toes have been. There's more. I always tell my art students, just be brave with it, right? And you can tell that the artist has really taken a leap, and we're starting to round off. So these things are not just incised lines, but they themselves are forms themselves. But we see that archaic smile that almost gives more of a life, right? Easy to jump to these two and say, yeah, that one seems like it's more real just because of that gesture in that face. Okay. And for the female forms, we usually get them in representation of goddesses, and we can tell because of the multiple layers of garments that they're wearing. Like, this is a sign of status. These would have originally been painted, probably like all the others, but especially these we know because of the pigment that's been found on the surface. And being of these female forms, right, there's an emphasis on the soft form and the curves, right, which really challenge an artist. Now, you may look and say, well, what's with the arms and stuff? So there's a couple theories on that. More or less, they would have been made out of stone and attached. Like, you notice how it's sort of recessed here, so the other piece would have been carved and pegged. But if you imagine if this was just one large stone, you're not going to chisel all the way back, right, just to have that one arm be extended. You're going to just take a smaller block, cut out that form, and then on a separate piece cut out the arm and attach it into there. Some believe that maybe they were out of wood, but it's been more that they were believed they were pegged in a way with just adding these extraneous pieces of stone. Okay. The architecture, right? This is going to be huge. You're going to need to know these terms for the tests and quizzes. But during this time, we're seeing structures shift to more permanent materials using the limestone and marble which is gathered for them. Now, this is important because it just shows us that the higher systems of organization are happening, and that they themselves are more collectively sort of come together and peaceful at this time. You build things during peacetime when you have the resources. During war, right, things kind of get put on hold. Right, so here's the terms you need to know: the cella, the peristyle, the metatopes, the Doric and Ionic columns. The columns are what we're really going to focus on, and we'll talk about more in detail, but this will give you sort of an idea of how these things were laid out. So this is the aerial view, right, of what a temple would have been, the cella being this inner walkway chamber. And the reason why we're looking at these and all of its components is because this architecture becomes the framework for the Romans, which becomes the framework for the Christians, which become the framework for even our own state buildings and such. So, like, it's just important to say, like, this is where this is starting, right? So that's why I want you to know these things. Now, ceramic wise, this is where we shift to the red figure painting, right? And these are what you think of a little bit more when we think of Greek vases, right? We see some characters playing games, right? These are representation of mythologies that are going on. It's more stereotypical, and these are really sort of adding to the exports for Greece that marketed Greece. Like, even still, if you went to Greece today, you would buy some sort of remake knockoff of this style of ceramics. So the red figure painting becomes the most dominant. We see artists though signing work at this time, and this is the first time. Now we're saying, like, okay, here's the artist. Now, what's interesting is that the artist is just the person painting. The person making the ceramic vase, they're just a ceramic or crafts person. And that's very key to know, because even as we moved into all the way into modern times, contemporary ceramicists still sort of had to fight that idea that they were craft people. And it's the painter who's then painting on it, signing it, and calling it their own. And so you don't see that the labor on the potter's wheel getting any credit at all. So because of the signature, we're able to track who's the most popular, right? What sort of skills are like, what sort of like style was most approved of. And it's just becoming like the most popular of images. So it's sort of the earliest forms of marketing. All right, the classical period, as we move forward even more, is when Persia is defeated. This is right, now the Spartans and Thermopylae have happened. They're trying to conquer Greece, right? And they're stopped. That movie gives you a little bit more, that it wasn't just 300 people, but either way, it tells a great story. And in this moment, many of the most famous Greeks are working, right? In this, and they create what we now call the canon of art. Canon is this set or standards, right? And these standards are what all art is then measured by this canon, saying, this is what makes good art and this is what makes bad art. And this idea that then really starts the whole movement to what we make now and what we challenge with our artwork to this day. The standard was usually one of beauty and artistic proportions and the rendering, right? We're trying to get that perfect form. What the Greeks started in this period, the Romans are going to copy, and eventually then copied again by the Renaissance, and then neoclassical, romanticism, right? The movement really never stops. It just keeps refining itself. We continue to go back to these classical ideas, thinking, no, this is where we should start our approach again, at the idea of perfection. So now this Kritos boy, right, we've looked at some other examples. This is really, really interesting, because in the scheme of history, this is the first sculpture that we've seen done this way. It's freestanding, and it has a stance that I want you to know that may not even be a term in your book, called contrapposto. And contrapposto is not just that stepping forward, but it's the shifting of the weight. And we're going to see, when you think of like Michelangelo's David, or really any sculpture, the legs aren't straight. There's just a slight bend into them, right? It gives them a little bit of posture. It makes the hips more at just a little bit of an angle. And that is sort of adds that archaic smile that says, okay, this thing has more life. And this is our very first sculpture that we find that is atomically correct in every way. They've reached it. They've reached their goal of perfection, of copying the human form, at least in marble. But what's weird about this, kind of like when we were talking about Egypt and we were talking about these pyramids, right? They were created sort of in the middle time, and then what happens, right? So they're able for the first time to create the perfect form, but what happened, right? They created harmony, their goals. So we begin to see, though, that they are going to then change, right? What's interesting is they kind of like, all right, well, we achieved perfection. Now what? Well, it's not still as beautiful as we want, right? We want rippling muscles. We want over-exaggeration. And I always tell students, it's kind of like when we think of graphic novels and stuff like that, whether it's depictions of female or male, like there's no female that has bosoms that big, waist that small, and is still able to have nunchucks and do backflips and do all that sort of stuff. Like, it's not possible. And the same with male form. They don't have muscles that are constantly rippling on top of rippling muscles on top of it. Just doesn't, those forms don't exist. But we like them to sort of like use in the moment to sort of emphasize sort of the dynamism of our characters. And there's some really interesting bronze pieces that are covered a little bit in this, but I want you to look at this video on lost wax casting first, so you can get an idea on how that process goes, because it's starting. They're using this technique to create more figures out of bronze, And with that we get some pieces that have lasted. It is known that a lot of Greek bronzes don't exist, and most true Greek sculptures don't exist anymore because they were either broken when they were conquered, or the bronze was melted down to make weapons. So there's very few that survive, and those that have survived come from shipwrecks. So pulling things out of the Mediterranean, we say, oh, yeah, they actually did know how to do this. So check that out. The Acropolis and their architecture. Okay, so the Acropolis is, just so we're clear, is that rock and sort of the mountain right here that it's built on. All this is the Acropolis, right? And the Parthenon sits on the Acropolis. So I've had some questions before about that, thinking it was a building. Well, it's not. It's the whole structure. And the structure itself has a lot of other sites on there, little temples and such. And has been used a lot over time. It's the most famous of Greek architecture. It's there in Athens. It's a very interesting building, as it was sort of a bank, more of a bank than a temple. It had been used a lot over time in different battles, and even when Napoleon came through, it was hit with a rocket, and they were storing their munitions there. So on this back side is blown apart because that's where they had stored, gunpowder and such like that. And so it's seen a lot. Of course, all the sculptures up here in the frieze have been taken and are in the British museums, and that's another one of those where things were just kind of appropriated, conquered, and then they can't get them back. But we do have examples of what was up on top. But the Greek historians would like to have their own artifacts back, and that's still sort of an ongoing petition and debate. So I've talked already about some of this, but Parthenon is a symbol of Greece and sort of its tragic story, and I've mentioned some of that already. And this is one example of a piece that has been taken down, and a lot of it has to be taken down now because of like acid rain and things like that. And so we see the mythologies being played out, and of course they are sort of badly damaged, but there's enough there to give us an idea of what they knew of artistically with relief and how to create relief sculptures. Now, the late classical, this is what I was talking about, where they've already achieved perfection. So what the heck are they going to do next? It's defined by the end of the Peloponnesian War, right? Greece has been overtaken by Sparta, and Macedonia, which was up there in the north. And Macedonia is where we get Alexander the Great. And he is, of course, trained, educated there in Greece. He's very much Greek because of his teacher, Herodotus. And so he's a pretty smart dude. And the arts at this time, though, they may not appear to really be changing, but like I said, it's going from perfection to this idealized. Now, I talked briefly before when I showed you those female sculpted pieces where the arms were sort of had to be attached in a different way, and I talked about their clothing. Well, now we have where the clothing is stripped away, right? We're seeing for the first time the goddesses being sort of stripped bare, which in ways is sort of insulting, right? This is a statue of Aphrodite, and now it's not one of sort of honor; it's one of sexualization, right? It's they're naked, and the gods have never been represented this way before. So we may think of like, oh yeah, Greek nude, whatever. Yeah, but this is really the first time we've seen it for the gods, right? Everybody else has just been sort of a common character. They were just boys, or they were just other men, warriors, right? But now with gods being stripped bare, it's kind of saying, all right, we want to see them as we see ourselves. This object may be one that is of desire. We see that contrapposto stance, right, that in a better regard, but we do see a lot of the freeing of the arms, right? This is a really sort of beautiful piece that's emerging more and more out of the block. All right, we also have mosaics going on. There are two types. We have pebble mosaics and tesserae mosaics. Pebble mosaics are made with small colored stones, where tesserae are ceramic or glass tiles that have been made and then cut and then placed into those details. So we'll see a lot of mosaics from here on out. The reasons why we see mosaics more than even frescoes is one, the frescoes may have been there, but have been destroyed over time. Two, there's more vivid colors. They could do things larger scale. Because if you imagine trying to work with a material that's drying so quickly, you just can't work as large. So the materials themselves really sort of dictated the form. And so with the mosaic tiles, not only are you getting permanence, but you're getting time, and from there you can do this on walls, you can do this on floors. It's just a more versatile material. Okay, now the architecture, I told you we were going to get to the columns. These I put a big star next to. You need to know these. The Doric, or the earliest of columns, right? They're usually heavier at the base. They taper up towards the top with these fluted channels, and there's not much of a decoration that's going on, right? They're pretty simple. As we move into the Ionic, we have a straighter column, still fluted, but we have a base that's added, something that gives us sort of an ending, where this feels like, well, maybe it's continuing and it's chopped off. Well, no, that's the end. Well, here we see that base, and we see this spiraling. Some say it's like a ram's horn, but we're getting a little bit more decoration to the capital. And then we have the end, which is sort of a combination of where it's thicker, usually thicker at the bottom, tapering up, but not so thick, not like these. These are pretty heavy base with the Doric. These can still carry a lightweight feeling to them. They have that decorative base, but then they have an extremely ornate capital. So that's how you're going to be able to tell the difference. The first most is these capitals. Basic, spiral, most elaborate, but you need to know those. All right, the Hellenistic period. So this is really after Alexander the Great is dead, and he's spread the Greek ideas all over the place. Okay, so he's done it here, there, everywhere. And the art continues to sort of push the boundaries in scale, especially with architecture, because as he's conquering, he's having things built and impressed. So we've talked about the clerestory with Egyptian style, and they've using that. In fact, these, you'd almost say, kind of feels a little bit more Egyptian because of the stone and such. But what they've done is using that post and lintel system, right? They've removed all the middle pillars and used wood in the center here, which allows, and we can kind of see an example, which allows for wider spaces, more light, and these really become the early forms of what called stoas, or these little mall areas. This is the idea of a stoa. You can walk down, and this becomes our idea of like a mini mall or shopping mall, or what these stoas. You'd have all these little tiny niches of stores along here, so you could go shopping. And this is one of the main architectural features of it. Sculpture-wise, we see this really dramatic sculpture happening, and there's really a language when you study. This is a survey class, but if you could spend probably several years on just Greek art, and in there they create pieces and murals or whatever, and their bodies have a language to them, meaning that if they're posed in a certain way, they are meant to represent a certain thing. So what we see here is what is known as the dying Gaul, and we see this individual who's, definitely sort of suffering, sitting there defeated. And usually what happens is when we see an arm raised over the head in any sort of artwork, it means that this person is dying or is going to die. So this sculpture did something a little bit different in that the arms may not be raised, but they're using the gesture of the entire body to sort of give us this idea that, okay, they're dying. So they're using a little bit different language than before. But it contains this life and emotion, right? They're trying to show real details within the hair. They aren't depicting now gods or leaders, right? This is just a common everyday person. In fact, it's your enemy, right? You're not even standing over, you don't even have a conqueror on top of that enemy saying, we defeated you. You're just looking at an individual that's dying. And we know their status because of the neckband that's going around here, right? Gauls were known to have sort of these leather neckbands. So there's those sort of details that are giving us even more idea. All right, and on these next few slides, I just want to show you a continuation of these sculptures that, for their importance and their continuation of what it is the Greeks are doing at this particular time period. As we start to focus on the dynamism, right, we're really separating ourselves from the block. The sculptors are becoming even more aggressive in how they're going about the surface, right? We have this, something almost looks wet, right? The clothing that's clinging to the skin here. Winged Victory, or known as Nike, is actually in the Louvre. If you walk up some steps, it's right there. It has this appearance like it's on the edge of a ship, like a bow of a ship, like coming out at you. It's meant to be a very confronting piece. And so they're looking at that movement. They're looking at how the viewer is going to interact with this, which is a very modern way of looking at art. The same with the Venus de Milo, right? We have that, once again, stripping bare of the gods. And this one, more than even the other Aphrodite, is more highly sexualized because we have this idea of like, oh, they're partially clothed, right? It's not just completely bare where the secrets. Now there's the secrets being kept from you. So we see that human form being exposed in a new way. But it's works like these that are going to really inspire the Renaissance, and what we know of as those artists, a part of that. Really, when Greeks when they're on the sort of the last leg, and Rome, the Romans are going to take over, and we're going to talk more about this. This is some of the last years of their artwork here. This piece called Laocoon has a really interesting history, and this is a Roman copy, and it's really interesting because apparently when it was found and being unearthed, it said that Michelangelo, meaning he was in Rome at the time, and this is found a little bit, I think it was more farther north, but when it was found in this palace during the Renaissance, being unearthed, he rode a horse over an insane amount of distance so quickly because he wanted to be the first artist to see it, to study it, to know their tricks, right? And so it's a very important piece. But we are seeing, if you looked at this, you'll say, oh yeah, that Michelangelo could have totally done that or been a part of that. Well, no, this is Greek. This is thousands, about 2,000, about 1,000, 1,500 years before the Renaissance. So just to give you an idea, yeah, it's pretty impressive what they became.